From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. I am Carolyn Brown. I direct the Office of Scholarly Programs and the John W. Kluge Center here at the library. And on behalf of the Librarian of Congress, James H. Billington, I am delighted to welcome you here this afternoon for a lecture by Morton Kondracki, who will be speaking about his research that he's been doing on the career of Congressman Jack Kemp. But before we begin, I would ask if you have cell phones that might go off, to please turn those off, or any other electronic equipment that might interfere with the speaker or with the recording. This event is sponsored by the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. The center was established through a very generous donation by John W. Kluge to provide a venue where the world of ideas and the world of affairs, where the thinkers and the doers might have an opportunity to come together on Capitol Hill for informal conversation. These highly accomplished senior scholars also engage in their own research while they're here at the center. In addition, we also bring into the center some of the world's most promising junior scholars, the rising generation who we hope will be the senior scholars at some point 20 years in the future perhaps. And together we form a community. The center also promotes the scholarly enterprise through lectures, seminars, and small conferences. If you're interested, you can sign up on the Kluge's webpage for additional information. Just go to the library webpage, www.loc.gov. On the right-hand side, you'll see Kluge Center listed, and you can go to our page and sign up. Or if you don't like to remember webpage URLs, you can also pick up a brochure in the back, and that has them. Today's speaker, Mort Kondracki, is the first Kemp Scholar in political economy. The Kemp Scholar position is part of the Kemp Project at the library, which is designed to preserve the record of Jack Kemp's public service and to advance knowledge of his contributions to American political thought, both by making his papers available for scholars, researchers, and the general public, and these are in the manuscript division, and then to support a scholar who will work on these papers and make the collection come alive through research and other conversation. In this academic year that Mort has been at the center, he's been drawing on the Kemp collection in the manuscript division, the library's general collections, doing a lot of interviews with congressmen and others who worked with Kemp, and drawing on his own experience as a journalist for many years during the same period. His focus has been on Kemp's years in politics, both in Congress and when as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development in the Bush administration. Now, Mort is well known to many of you for his career as a very distinguished journalist, a graduate of Dartmouth College. His career has included positions at Roll Call, New Republic, Newsweek, and Wall Street Journal. He's a Fox News commentator and was a regular panelist on the McLaughlin Group, which was how I first met him. These, I think it was Saturday night television, as well as ABC's This Week. A Nieman Fellow at Harvard, he was also frequently appeared on Meet the Press and NPR, and is the author of the best-selling book, Saving Millie, Love, Politics, and Parkinson's Disease. We're delighted that Mort will be also extending his stay at the center. So we know there are even more great things to come beyond what you'll hear. But right now, please welcome Mort Kondracki.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, and thank you all for being here. I want to say thanks to a lot of people. I'm really grateful to Jimmy Kemp and the Kemp Foundation and the Kemp family for first retaining me to conduct an oral history project, and for supporting the Jack Kemp Chair in Political Economy, which, as Carolyn said, I'm the first occupant. And thanks to Dr. Billington, the librarian, and to Carolyn for making me welcome and giving me a happy home here at the library. I have been working on the Kemp archives. There's 349 boxes of materials, memos, speeches, papers, and so on that I've been trying to dig my way through. And the fruits of the oral history project will be part of the Kemp archive eventually, and be online for people to either read the transcripts or watch the audio and videotapes. So 18 months ago, when Jimmy approached me to do this, I was retiring from a career of almost 50 years covering politics, and I was retiring partly out of despair at the negativism that prevails in Washington, D.C., and prevents Congress and the President from accomplishing anything in the way of solving America's really serious problems, and partly because I got tired of listening to myself scolding them all the time and vainly hoping that they would do better. So it was a true blessing that I got to relive my experience covering politics by chronicling the life and the service of somebody who is the antithesis of what's happening now in Washington, D.C., and more importantly, ought to be a model for those who want to put our politics back on track. Jack Kemp was a man who got big things done, and he got them done the right way. And as one of his former aides, Bruce Bartlett, said when Jack died in 2009, he was the most important Republican of the 20th century who was not president. And I think a good case can be made that that was the case. Of course, he was the original author of the legislation that became the basis of Ronald Reagan's economic program, which ended a decade of stagflation and malaise, and spawned a decade of prosperity in the country. He also was the author of the legislation that became the basis of the most important tax reform in decades, something that we need a repetition of today. And as the ranking Republican on the committee that funded foreign operations of the government, he assisted freedom movements around the world and helped Ronald Reagan win the Cold War. At the same time, as the title of my lecture indicates, this was an idealist and not a cynic. His grand vision he called the American idea. And the American idea was that every American, indeed every person on the face of the earth, could fulfill his or her God-given potential if governments created the right incentives and removed impediments to their progress, especially high taxes, but also social impediments such as racial discrimination. And in contrast to many politicians in Washington today, he was passionately dedicated to the well-being of all Americans and not just to members of special interest groups. Now, an exception to that would be the people who lived in and around Buffalo, New York, which of course are the people that he represented. He was a principled conservative, and he was a Republican leader, but he was incapable of negative or personal campaigning against his adversaries. He thought that ideas are what rule the world, and he never fought his battles on any plane but the level of ideas. And he did this, he kept to this rule even when it cost him politically, and it did cost him politically. When he ran for president in 1988, he was urged to go after his rivals, who were Pat Robertson, George Bush, and Bob Dole, to go after them and play negative politics. He wouldn't do it. He was expected, when was nominated for, as vice president in 1996 to play the attack dog against Bill Clinton and Al Gore. He wouldn't do that either. You know, those would have been tough campaigns to win in any event, given the odds. He didn't win, but he didn't go take the low road in order to try to pull them out of the fire. Moreover, he was a man who worked across party lines. At a certain point, his tax cut ideas, his original tax cut ideas, were more popular among Democrats in the Senate than they were among Republicans. He collaborated with Democrats on the tax reform of 1986, specifically Bill Bradley of New Jersey. He worked with Democrats on his legislation to establish enterprise zones, which would have low taxes and bring enterprises into poverty-stricken areas, and also on his legislation to give public housing tenants a chance to own their own properties. And maybe the biggest example to be followed by politicians today, he never put his party ahead of his country. In fact, he often bucked his own party in order to do what he thought was right and advocate the ideas that he thought was right. He was an advocate of economic growth, not austerity, and he called himself a radical, populist, revolutionary Republican, in contrast to conventional Republicans who he called deep root canal Hooverite Republicans who thought that who were fixated on balancing budgets even if it created unemployment in the process. And he called himself a bleeding heart conservative and argued that the Republican Party could once again become the natural home of African Americans. First, because he thought Republicans, like he did, ought to campaign in African American areas, and secondly, because he thought that if the Republican Party adopted his ideas and created the prosperity and the jobs that he thought it would, that African Americans would get the jobs and would thank the Republican Party for it and vote Republican. I said he was an idealist. I did not say that he was a realist in all matters. So people have asked me, what is the most surprising thing that you've learned at studying Jack Kemp's career? And for one thing, I guess for sure, the Arnold Schwarzenegger wrestling match is got to be one of them. So Jack had never met Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was the governor of California, and he was pumped actually about the idea that he was going to meet the Arnold. And Jack is down on the floor of the House voting, and Arnold Schwarzenegger has come to Jack's office, and Jack comes running into the office, and he throws off his coat, and he gets down on the floor, and he says, "Come on, Arnold, let's wrestle." And he puts his arm up in the arm wrestling position, and Arnold is standing there. He wouldn't bite, and his staff was perfectly aghast. Dave Hoppe, his then chief of staff, is the one who told me all about this. And he said, "Come on, Arnold, come on, get down on the floor." And Arnold wouldn't do it. But it's probably lucky for Jack, because even though Jack had been a pro quarterback and he was in great shape, kept himself in great shape playing tennis and all that, he was not a bodybuilder. Jack was a quarterback, not a Terminator, right? So that's part of the fun side of Jack Kemp, and there's loads of stories that I've accumulated about that. We can get into that if you want. But I think that the most surprising thing from a serious standpoint is the courage that Kemp showed in opposing policies of Ronald Reagan, a president that he otherwise admired, supported, even revered. He and Ronald Reagan went back in time to 1967, when Jack was a quarterback for the Buffalo Bills, and he was a native Californian and had played for the San Diego Chargers, and he was befriended by Herb Klein, who was the publisher of the San Diego Union, and Klein had a lot of Republican connections, and Klein arranged for Jack to be a speechwriter part-time on an off season for Ronald Reagan. So he knew Ronald Reagan. I found one letter in the Kemp files from 1976 when Jack was in his third term, where Jack is proposing to Reagan, who was about to run against Gerald Ford for the Republican nomination for president, recommending that Jack's Jobs Creation Act be the basis of Republican economic policy for the 1976 election. This is by way of saying, Reagan, run on my economic plan. And the letter actually says, it was great talking to you this morning on the phone. So they were connected. Now, by background, the Jobs Creation Act, originally introduced in 1974 when Jack was just 4 years into his congressional career, was his first foray into tax policy. Kemp got into economic policy because his hometown, Buffalo, New York, was losing jobs, losing industry, and he figured that something had to be done. So one day he saw an ad in a Buffalo paper that said in big letters, "Lathe operators wanted." And then in little letters it says, "Bring your own lathe." And so this gave him the idea that what was necessary was capital formation in order that people could buy lathes. And so what he did, the Jobs Creation Act came out of that, and it was an amalgam of basically business-friendly tax policies, which Randy Teague, his then chief of staff, called a Chamber of Commerce wish list. And it was opposed by the Ford administration, which thought that tax cuts would fuel inflation, which was then the dominant concern of every administration throughout the 1970s. In fact, in 1974, the inflation rate was 11%. It's now practically down to nothing. And Reagan actually touted the Jobs Creation Act in one of his radio addresses and referred to this young congressman, Jack Kemp from Buffalo, who used to be a quarterback for the Buffalo Bills, and Reagan said, we should help him pass this bill. Nothing really came of the Jobs Creation Act, and Kemp actually stayed neutral in the 76 presidential race between Reagan and Ford. But it's interesting that Jack Kemp's foray into tax policy was not only opposed by the Ford administration, it was deeply resented by senior Republicans in the House of Representatives and the Senate. They thought that he was treading on the turf of the House Ways and Means Committee, which is the place that tax laws are written. Jack Kemp revolutionized tax policy in the United States twice without ever being a member of the Tax Writing Ways and Means Committee. He was berated for treading on out of his lane, as it was so called, in the Chowder and Marching Society. There's this dinner club of promising and senior Republican House members that meets on, I guess, on Wednesday nights. And Jack Kemp, came out of some of those meetings shaken at the fact that senior Republicans were beating him up for getting into tax policy when it allegedly wasn't his business. So then in 1976, under the influence of Jude Wanniski, who was a Wall Street Journal editorial writer and a kind of a strange guy, but brilliant, and became one of Jack Kemp's closest advisors, I guess you'd say, and political instigators. Jude and other supply-side economists convinced Jack that the way to go was not Chamber of Commerce business tax cuts, but individual tax cuts across the board, especially cutting marginal tax rates. Marginal tax rate is the rate you pay on the next dollar you earn. So if that tax rate is too high, you're not going to bother to earn it, right? And so if you cut marginal tax rates, you'll have an incentive to work and save and invest and so on, and that will stimulate prosperity. I didn't know what marginal tax rates were when I was covering Jack Kemp, so I asked Jack one day, what is a marginal tax rate? And Jack very patiently explained to me what a marginal tax rate is, and now I've just explained it to you. So, so he asked his staff, and Bruce Bartlett was the staff guy who was responsible for doing it, to try to duplicate the 1963 tax cuts proposal of Jack Kennedy, which was not enacted while Kennedy was alive, but was enacted after the assassination by Lyndon Johnson, which cut the top tax rate from 91%, where it was before that, down to 70%. And Kemp's idea was to duplicate that and cut the top rate from 70% down to 50%, and the lowest rate from 14% down to 8%. And that was another foray by a backbencher into tax policy. But this time, in 1978, it became national Republican policy. All of a sudden, Jack goes from being berated by members of the senior echelons of the House Republican Party to having his proposal lionized and adopted by all House Republicans. Every single House Republican signed on to this, even though some of the traditionalist Republicans were mumbling and grumbling about it, but nonetheless they signed on to it. There were some senior senators who kept mumbling and grumbling even in public about it, but this was a House thing. So why did they do this? One, because the Republicans had been shellacked in the 1976 elections post-Watergate, and they needed something to run on. So, and here was a new idea, a good idea to cut taxes, and they all signed on to it. Secondly, it became Republican policy because Bill Brock, then the Republican National Chairman, had been to England and seen what Margaret Thatcher could do in the way of positive campaigning with a cause, and brought it back and found Jack's proposal and decided that was a good idea and pushed it through the Republican National Committee, and so it became national policy. It was called Kemp Roth. Senator Roth, Bill Roth, who was a Republican from Delaware, a member of the Senate Finance Committee, but he was just the co-sponsor. It was really Jack's idea, and Senator Roth actually asked him to postpone, to delay to spread it out over a 3-year period instead of having swift tax cuts, and he also wanted the lowest rate not to be as low as Jack recommended. Now, this was not simply a policy departure from the way things had been done. This was a kind of an intellectual revolution in policy. Now, remember, Jack Kemp had been a phys ed major at Occidental College in California. As a football player, when the teams were, traveling from game to game, the rest of the guys were reading Sports Illustrated or Playboy, but Jack was reading history and economics, and he never stopped. His whole life long, he was a voracious reader and basically a self-taught intellectual. And by the late 1970s, he was the leading advocate of the supply-side movement, which was challenging the intellectual policy, tax policy and economic policy that had been dominant for 4 decades, namely Keynesianism after John Maynard Keynes. Keynesianism was in crisis, intellectual crisis in the late 1970s, because it had no way of explaining the conditions that prevailed at the time. So you had high inflation and high unemployment at the same time. Keynesian economics does not account for that. Under Keynesianism, everything is a function of demand, right? So if too many people are employed and they're buying stuff, inflation is going to rise because there's the price of labor and the price of goods will all be bid up, and that's the definition of inflation. So if you want to fight inflation, according to Keynesianism, what you have to do is you have to create unemployment. You have to raise taxes, cool things off. You have to cut government spending, cool things off. Unemployment will rise, and you'll control inflation. This is through austerity, and this is actually what the Carter administration was advocating, an era of limits. And you remember Gerald Ford was advocating, lick your plate clean, whip inflation now, all of that, and it was largely the way they wanted to do it was to induce unemployment. And Jack was dead set against it, and so were the supply-siders. So the basis of the supply-side movement is that the way you control inflation is by moderating money supply. That is, you don't print as much money. And the way you control unemployment is that you cut taxes, not raise taxes, because if you cut taxes, people will have incentives to work and save and invest, and people will get jobs as a result of it, and taxes you'll have more revenues, and actually deficits may go down and not up. So it was a new idea. Jack Kemp is the intellectual leader of it in the Congress, and so here it is challenging Keynesianism, which had been the dominant theory taught in everybody's economics book. Most of us who studied Ec 101 were taught Keynesian economics by Paul Samuelson and nothing else, right? So supply side was a major departure from that. Now, one of the interesting wrinkles in the research that I've done is, so what is Ronald Reagan's attitude toward Kemp Roth and supply-side economics? There's no question that Kemp Roth ends up being the basis of Ronald Reagan's economic program for the 1980 election and for his administration. What's controversial is the process by which that happened. So, Reagan, as he was preparing to run for president in 1980, made a lot of economic speeches. And some of them were supply sides. Some of them called for tax cuts, but a lot of other speeches were conventional Republican. We got to cut spending first as a way to restore economic health. And so there was this duality in Reagan's approach, and the supply-siders listened to it, and they didn't know sometimes which side Reagan was on. So if you listen to Reaganites, permanent Reaganites like Ed Meese, who was later White House counsel and then Attorney General, Reagan was a supply-sider from the get-go, and as his proof, Ed Meese cites the fact that there was a policy memo number 1 of the Reagan campaign, written in August of 1979, actually calls for income tax rate cuts across the board for a period of 3 years. It doesn't say how much, but nonetheless, this document, advocates that. So that's the claim that Reagan was supply side from the beginning. But there's another point of view, which is, you might call it the Kempite side, that Reagan was converted to supply side at a meeting that took place in early January 1980 at the Marriott Hotel near Los Angeles International Airport, which was attended by Jack and members of his staff, including John Mueller, who unfortunately can't be here today, and Dave Smick, who was his chief of staff at the time, plus all of Reagan's high command, plus Jude Winniski, who was by that time had been fired by the Wall Street Journal and was then a consultant economist, and Arthur Laffer, the famous author of the Laffer Curve, who was an advisor to both Kemp and Reagan. Incidentally, as a sidelight, Winniski, this crazy guy who wore black shirts and white ties and stuff like that, and Laffer tried to hatch a plot whereby Jack would run for president against Ronald Reagan in 1980, then throw his support to Reagan, and as a result of that, be named vice president. And there was an entire scenario for doing this, and Jack was supposed to go out to a guest house at Arthur Laffer's house, guest cottage at Arthur Laffer's house, and make the pitch to Ronald Reagan that, you know, I'm going to run against you, but I'm really for you, and all that. And Jack couldn't do it, wouldn't do it, and said, you know, Governor, I admire you so much, I'm supporting you. And the whole thing, you know, the whole Laffer-Winooski plot blew up. So, I mean, you know, Jack Kemp was a Reagan loyalist, no question about it. Now, the contrary version to the Mies version is that this LAX meeting was the boarding party like at a pirate ship movie, you know, they board the ship, or like an interdiction at sea, a conversion experience for Ronald Reagan. So I've looked at all the evidence on both sides, and I think that the bottom line that I come to is that Ronald Reagan is an instinctive supply-sider. I mean, he just sort of gets it. And in fact, you know, he was a movie star, and he made 6 movies a year, but the 7th movie, he would be taxed at 90%, and he said, the hell with it. You know, I don't need that movie. So he understood from personal experience that what marginal tax rates were all about. But he wasn't an economic theorist, and he wasn't really particularly an economic policy guru. So, you know, he sometimes argued supply side and sometimes argued not supply side. So what I conclude is that this meeting at LAX, rather than being a boarding party, was a kind of a confirmation event where the Reagan team decided that yes, Kemp Roth, the way that it was formulated, Jack Kemp's idea, would be the basis of their policy. It was a policy decision rather than an epiphany that took place. But anyway, all of this is by way of saying that Jack Kemp, one, and Ronald Reagan go back a long way, and two, that they were, you know, that Kemp was a big supporter. So Reagan wins in a landslide, as we all know, in 1980, and Jack becomes the number 3 leader of House Republicans. And Kemp also had some influence in getting people appointed to the Reagan administration. He got a whole bunch of supply-siders appointed to the Treasury Department, and in the biggest mistake of this little episode, he thought that David Stockman, congressman from Wisconsin, good friend of his, who sounded like a supply-sider and tipped his hat in the direction of supply-side, should be the director of the Office of Management and Budget, and that he would promote a supply-sidism from the inside of the White House. As the Reagan administration worked to get its tax program underway to be enacted by Congress, you had 2 schools fighting with one another. The Treasury gang wanted to have swift, deep tax cuts right away, but Stockman, having had a conversion of his own to deficit hawkism, was fighting against, you know, the policy that he had previously advocated. So you had this intense intrigue going back and forth between Treasury and the White House, you know, over the contents of the tax bill and the way it was portrayed in public, and you know, and the White House staff, the top echelons of the White House staff, that is Jim Baker, the White House chief of staff, and David Gergen, the communications director, both of whom had been George Bush allies, and don't forget that George Bush called supply-side economics voodoo economics during the campaign. They were on Stockman's side. So you had leaks going back and forth, and lots of the leaks ended up with Evans and Novak, Bob Novak being Jack Kemp's favorite journalist. And by the way, one of the best accounts of this entire era is a book that Bob Novak wrote called The Reagan Revolution. But there are other good books of the period too that I've read, including one by Paul Craig Roberts, who was the chief supply-sider at that time in the Treasury Department. So in any event, in August of 1981, as it all works out, Reagan's tax program passes the Congress more or less in Kemp-Roth form, but watered down in terms of its timing, and added to with Christmas trees, ornaments worth of special interest tax breaks for this corporation and that corporation that were just added in a feeding frenzy as the Congress was passing the bill. So the tax cut package is passed, right? So meantime, Jimmy Carter had appointed Paul Volcker to be the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, and he carried on into the Reagan administration. And Paul Volcker decided that he was going to control inflation by inducing a recession that will curl your hair. So he crunched down on money supply. Interest rates went shooting through the roof, and basically, and unemployment went up to, as it happened, to 9.7%. So inflation was duly held under control, but a recession was the consequence of it. What supply-siders wanted was a more gradual tightening of the money supply. In fact, what Jack Kemp advocated throughout was a return to the gold standard, which never got anywhere, which he thought would gradually, modulate money supply, gradually control inflation. And the idea was that the tax cuts would counteract the reduction of money supply, and you'd have growth as a consequence, that the growth through tax cuts would be bigger than the down in the economy influenced by the Fed's tightening money supply. But what happened was the exact opposite. We had a deep recession, as I said, unemployment up to 9.7%. So this is where Jack Kemp begins to show his independence from Ronald Reagan. Now remember, he is number 3 in the House Republican leadership. He's supposed to carry the party line, but he publicly criticized Paul Volcker, even though Ronald Reagan was supporting Paul Volcker. He urged Ronald Reagan not to reappoint Paul Volcker in 1984. Reagan did reappoint Paul Volcker. Because of the recession, there was a dramatic reduction in federal revenues, and therefore the deficit went up. And the deficit hawks in the White House, led by David Stockman, and in Congress, all were determined that taxes had to be raised again, and that spending had to be cut in order to contain the deficit that was resulting from the recession. And so having passed, and so there was a lot of dealing. And remember, during the entire time that Jack was in Congress, Democrats were in charge of the House of Representatives. So Reagan passes the largest tax cut in American history, $264 billion in 1981. And then in 1982, he passes the biggest tax increase in American history up to that point, $57 billion. And he agreed to another tax increase in 1983, $25 billion, and another tax increase in 1984. And Jack Kemp, a leader of the Republicans in Congress, opposes them all. And he got a lot of grief for it. Paul Laxalt, who was Ronald Reagan's best friend in Congress, accused Jack of lacking loyalty. And Bob Dole, who was in favor of practically every tax increase and was a kind of an intellectual nemesis of Jack's, said that all Jack cares about is his burning ambition. Unnamed White House aides leaked it to the New York Times and to Evans and Novak that Jack Kemp was playing presidential politics at Ronald Reagan's expense. And Ronald Reagan himself writes in his diary on August 4th, 1982, quote, "Met with Jack Kemp alone and then in a leadership meeting. He is adamant that we are wrong on the tax increase. He is in fact unreasonable. The tax increases are the price we had to pay in order to get budget cuts." So Kemp opposed Reagan. And he also opposed Reagan, by the way, on foreign policy, on some foreign policy. Basically, Kemp was the leader of the Reagan doctrine, supporting freedom fighters all over the world, supporting a strong anti-communist foreign policy. But, in fact, he was more Reaganite than other people in the Reagan administration, and he thought, and he criticized the fact that, for example, the Reagan State Department would not extend support to Jonas Savimbi, who was leading anti-communist rebels in Africa, and he opposed some of Reagan's arms control treaties, believing that the Soviets would cheat on them and that the United States would be worse off. And he actually called in 1988 for Reagan to fire George Shultz as Secretary of State and employ and hire Gene Kirkpatrick in his place. So the point I'm making is not that Jack Kemp was unreasonable or that he was disloyal to Reagan. And Jack Kemp may have been wrong about some of these things, but the point is that he was principled and he was brave. I mean, he knew what he thought, and he was not afraid to say it, and he took the consequences. He took a lot of heat for it. And as proof that he was a Reaganite, if there needed to be any proof, in December of 1985, he almost single-handedly saved what was then the leading economic policy of the Reagan administration and also of Jack Kemp's, namely tax reform, which the entire Republican conference in the House was against because it didn't bring tax rates down enough. And Jack Kemp actually persuaded Ronald Reagan to come and address the House Republican conference, and then reversed his own vote and made it possible for the bill to pass the House, get to the Senate, be rewritten, stay alive, and eventually it cut the top rate from 50% down to 33% in a great triumph of tax policy. So all of this is to say, tax reform is what we need right now in order to encourage growth and bring down deficits as well. So the bottom line, this is a remarkable figure who really made a difference in American history, and somebody that I am honored and proud to be chronicling. I covered him. I knew him. I liked him. Matter of fact, all reporters liked him. I mean, you could not help it. I mean, he was available, number one issue for journalists. He was friendly. He was upbeat. He did stuff, so he was interesting to cover. But beyond that, my research has led me to really admire this guy, especially now when the world out there needs his example. He was always positive. He thought that if you put your mind to something, you could do it. And as a matter of fact, the only way you could do it was put your mind to something. And this went all the way back to his youth. He was a high school quarterback who was not big enough to play for USC or one of the other big colleges, so he went to Occidental, where he fortunately met his wife, and the result has been wonderful children and a wonderful life. But in addition to that, he was a small college All-American, but he wanted to play pro football. So he went into the pros, and he was cut by one team after another. Five teams he was cut from. He did not quit, and eventually he got signed on with the San Diego Chargers and then the Buffalo Bills, and he won AFL championships, and he was a star. It was a matter of will. I found in the files a doctor's report from San Diego, in which it's directed to Jack Kemp, and it says, "You have had your shoulder separated so many times that you will never play football again." This was San Diego, before Buffalo, before the national championships. He did not buy it that his shoulder had been separated. So, and famously, in a game, he hit his middle finger of his throwing hand on the helmet of an opposing player, and he played the game out, and it swelled up, and the doctor said, we have to fuse this finger. And he said, get me a football. So he gets a football, and he has it fused in the shape of a football. So ever afterwards, you know, you shook hands with Jack Kemp, and it was like that because his finger had been fused. But I mean, this is somebody who would not be defeated by anything. And he was not only positive about football, he was positive about everything. And in the first speech that he made to a Republican National Convention, he said, you can do anything you want to do if you believe that you can do it. And if you don't believe you can do it, you will fail. And he said that Republicans cannot afford to just, as a matter of fact, Republicans cannot just oppose whatever Democrats stand for. We have to stand for things of our own. And this is the beginning of his, you know, positive approach to Republican politics. So this is a quarterback's mentality. And he told his kids, you know, every day, be a leader. And he was a leader. And without making a political speech to you, it seems to me that what we need today is leaders who will espouse positive, growth-oriented policies and who also know how to win support from adversaries and not demonize them. I mean, I don't necessarily think that lower taxes are always the answer at every time and, you know, for every economic circumstance. But I do know that they were the right policy for his time. And I do think that we will never get the problems that we have solved now, which are different. Now we have big debt, we have unemployment, unless the people across the street and the people down Pennsylvania Avenue will adopt the spirit of Jack Kemp. And foremost among the spirit of Jack Kemp is his idealism. With that, I will stop and I will answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much. Questions, comments? Yes, sir, Bruce Bartlett.
Oh, thanks. Incidentally, I was in Kemp's office that day Schwarzenegger showed up. I just happened to be in the neighborhood, and I came by, and that's the one and only time I ever met Schwarzenegger. But anyway, there is one question I've always wondered about Jack, and if you don't know the answer, perhaps Joanne does. I've never understood exactly why he didn't take the opportunities that he had to move to higher office. That is to say, I know he was pretty much offered the governor's nomination in 1978, and he passed that up. And I thought it was because he would really rather have been a senator. And why he didn't take the opportunity to run in 1980 is, I think, you know, one of those great unanswered questions. And I was wondering if you have any insights on that, because, and maybe you disagree with that, but if he had won, which he certainly would have, because he was a much better candidate than Al D'Amato, who did, he would have unquestionably been the Republican nominee in 1988 and therefore been president.
Joanne can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the governorship, he would have run against Mario Cuomo. He was from an, okay, all right. Well, there were two opportunities then two times when he was supposed to run. One, he thought that he was not an administration kind of guy. He did not want to live in Albany and be running a state government. And secondly, I mean, the second time around, that when he was supposed to run against Mario Cuomo, he was in the midst of the Reagan Revolution, and he thought it was more fun and more purposeful to be in the House of Representatives. In 1980, Jacob Javits was suffering from Lou Gehrig's disease and was very sick, and Jack intended to run. I mean, the announcement speech was all written if Javits, as Jack expected, was going to step down. I mean, this is a person of high character. He was not going to challenge Jake Javits, who even if Jake Javits was going to run, he was not going to oppose a sitting senator of his own party. And so Javits decided that he was going to run. As a matter of fact, there was somebody from Jack's staff who was there at Javits' press conference, and the press release was ready to be issued from Jack's office. I'm running, and Javits announced that he was going to run, and Jack said, I'd rather, be part of the Reagan Revolution, and, I'm not going to run, and I'm not going to run against. Now, if he had, indeed, Al D'Amato did challenge Jacob Javits, Al D'Amato did defeat him, Al D'Amato did become senator, and Jack did not. So that's my understanding. Yes?
You say, quite rightly, you didn't believe in demonizing the opposition. He was active at the same time Newt Gingrich was active, I believe. Did you find anything in the record as what he thought of what Newt Gingrich was planning?
Newt was one of Jack's friends. He was junior to Jack. Jack was a leader. Newt was new in Congress. When Newt started organizing the Conservative Opportunity Society and haranguing against the Democratic leadership of Congress, which was dictatorial and did not listen to anything Republicans had to say, Jack was not in favor of the act. He was not in favor of this confrontational approach. He did not participate in it in these floor speeches that were intended for C-SPAN. He couldn't ban them from doing it, or he didn't really discourage them from doing it, but he did not participate. And my understanding is that he didn't think it was civil. Yes, sir.
Yes, I was wondering if you came across any information about the role that Jack Kemp played in rallying Republicans for what you were describing as the American idea that ought to apply to all Americans, that rallied Republicans to support the Martin Luther King holiday. And I wondered if you had come across any information in the files.
He did support he wavered at a certain early stage. Now, remember, Jack Kemp showered and roomed with African Americans as a football player. He had not an ounce of prejudice in his body. There was an early stage at which I thought, I actually don't know the answer to this part of it, why he was leery about the Martin Luther King holiday in the beginning. But when it became a big issue, he was one of the leaders in favor of it. And as a matter of fact, I got an email from Harris. Remember Harris Wofford, the senator, very liberal senator from Pennsylvania. So his chief of staff emailed me, knowing that I was working on Jack Kemp, about a story where Harris Wofford is a senator, and his staff wants him to go see Jack about some HUD issue in Pennsylvania, get money, basically want him to get money from HUD for Pennsylvania. So Harris Wofford goes off there and then comes back and reports that he never got around to asking Jack for the money, because the two of them just spent the entire time talking about Harris Wofford's experience with Martin Luther King marching in Selma and all that. So, Jack was totally enthralled with the history of the civil rights movement and was a supporter of the holiday. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry. I didn't see whose hand was up.
I was lucky enough to be involved with direct mail for Jack on more than one occasion for more than one of his groups. And two anecdotes you might want to use in the future, but one that really reinforces what you said about him being a man of principle and character. One was, a lot of us used to tease him that his speeches were too long, and staff members would get on him and tell him, he shouldn't talk for so long, and this and that and the other. Well, direct mail, we would do a 2 or 3 or 4 page piece of a copy. He'd turn it into a 6 page. And so we'd always try to convince him, no, he should do shorter. So we finally tested it, and his longer copy actually worked better, so we stopped fighting him. and of course lost that argument. But the one about character, in testing lots of different things for him and trying to find the best way, going into '88, into the presidential campaign, one of the most effective packages we had, it was not demonizing Tip O'Neill, but it was pointing out the very simple truth that O'Neill was sitting on several of Jack's biggest initiatives because they didn't want a Republican to get credit for things like enterprise zones or privatization, public housing, et cetera, et cetera. So the letter had a call to action besides raising money. Advocating people sign this note to Tip O'Neill saying, please let these things be voted on. I mean, it wasn't demonizing. It went through the roof. It raised money hand over fist. After a few months, Jack called us and said, we can't use the letter anymore. So everybody was apoplectic, and the staff came, and we assembled and met with him and said, what do you mean? This is incredible. It's going through the roof. It's providing new donors. It's getting the message out. It's putting on the pressure. He said, O'Neill called me and said, if we continue with this package, my issues will never see the light of day. And they're worth more to me than any money that you could raise.
Yep. I think they needed Newt Gingrich, actually. Yes, sir. Hey, John.
You mentioned bucking the president when the president was wrong. 1987, apartheid government in South Africa. Jack Kemp joins with Charlie Rangel and others to remove the deductibility of taxes paid to the South African apartheid government from your U.S. tax return, therefore doubling effectively the taxation on U.S. investments in South Africa. 2 years later, the apartheid government falls. Did you have any other examples of Jack Kemp believing that tax cuts were so effective that you needed to raise taxes on things that were evil? Or is that the only one?
That's the only one I can think of when Jack was ever in favor of a tax increase. And Jack, Reagan at one point vetoed an anti-apartheid resolution, and Jack sort of led the way in overturning the veto, and the veto was overridden in the Congress. Yes.
Thank you for coming and for all the research you've done. I'm curious if you would like to elaborate on Jack's relationship with Bob Dole. You mentioned Senator Dole was his intellectual nemesis. What was that relationship really like through the 80s and then going into the 90s? And leading up to 96, did Jack think they really had a chance to win? If the relationship had been acrimonious during the 80s, did 96 represent a chance to repair that? What did Jack think of the campaign? What was his relationship like with the senator?
Actually, I know this in part, but I don't know it completely. I mean, I know the earlier stuff, and acrimonious was another thing that I heard actually from Harris Wofford was about another occasion in 1996. Harris told me that he went to see Jack about. Now, Jack is, 1996, Jack is out of office. He's I can't remember why they were talking. I guess he wanted Jack's support for the Corporation for Community Service, the AmeriCorps. And so he goes in there to talk to Jack about that, and Jack actually told him, we're going to have the worst nominee we could possibly have in 1996, namely Bob Dole. And so, Bob Dole had the reputation of being the tax collector for the welfare state. He thought he was a deficit hawk. He was totally sincere about this, also acerbic, but he thought that the supply side economics was goofy. And as a matter of fact, he had this famous line about, there was a bus accident and lots of people died. There was only one thing wrong with it: the seat that was reserved for the supply side, it was empty. So there was no love lost between them for years and years and years. In 1996, my understanding is that Bob Dole thought that he needed the conservative wing of the Republican Party to be excited about his campaign, and so Scott Reed, who was his campaign manager, had been Jack Kemp's chief of staff at HUD, and earlier even was a campaign aide in the 1988 campaign, and partly Scott Reed and partly some other people who take credit for it, Charlie Black, among others, persuaded Dole that Kemp was the answer to his, his conservative wing of the party problem, and so he named Jack Kemp to the ticket, and then they became friends. They apparently settled. Now that Jack did not do what the Dole campaign wanted. Jack was expected to go out there and harangue against Al Gore and Bill Clinton, and Jack wouldn't do it. So everything was not hunky-dory between the Dole campaign and the Kemp end of the campaign. But nonetheless, my understanding is that they smoothed over their differences and became friends. Yes, sir.
I worked with Jack when I was in the National Security Council, providing him briefings as early as his campaign in 1972. The briefings were on Vietnam and on other very controversial issues. This man wanted to know. He wanted to know three-dimensionally. He wanted to talk to other people who thought they knew. And then I worked with him, had the great pleasure of working with him in 1987 to 1989 as a member of his staff in the Congress on foreign policy. And what was characteristic of him was that he talked, read with a diverse number of people and opinions. Jeane Kirkpatrick mentioned, Midge Decter, Democrats, Paul Nitze, whoever he could encounter. And if he read an article or a column in the newspapers, he would immediately task his staff to get him that person, not only that column, but articles by him. And he was a learned person, and when he spoke to his staff and when he gave formal speeches, he said the same things, which is a remarkable achievement for a politician. Reagan is one of the very few others where you can see in his writings, his personal writings, that he didn't need speech writers except to collect a number of really his own insights and back them up with more information and counter arguments and so on. And my question to you is that did he, in his 359 boxes of materials or whatever it was that you encountered, did he leave behind some statement, some writing, some preliminary autobiography or something that talks about his learning experience, his pilgrimage, his vocation, his moral and strategic insights, which were phenomenal, and I would love to know.
There is nothing like that in the files. What I've learned about his education, I've basically learned from reading and from the interviews, and I've talked to members of his family. I've talked to his two surviving brothers, and lots of staff. And you're right about how he talked to staff. And he was the most inclusive person I've encountered in politics. I mean, somebody I can't remember who it was. One of the chiefs of staff said that it was like a graduate seminar every day in his office. I mean, and somebody would come in, Bibi Netanyahu or someone else would come visiting, or Natan Sharansky would come visiting, and they would visit Jack Kemp because he was the chairman, the ranking member of the House Foreign Ops Committee, and so the staff would all be around, and got to participate and so on. So,
one other thing.
Sure.
He was a man. You could see that you could feel that he loved his country. He loved America. He loved the American idea, the American dream, and he was very much aware, as Martin Luther King was. He said, I still have a dream. That's the first word that Martin Luther King used, and most people don't remember that he started out that catalog by saying still. And he was aware, Jack Kemp was, of some of the problems and faults and tragedies in American history, but he was so imbued by that spirit, plus a very strong religious undertone always. He wasn't explicit about it. And he's one of the very few politicians I've ever met who, when he talked about his family, and particularly when he could not say his children's name without tearing up. That is a remarkable standing for a person of that public a nature and who seemed to be able to do everything. He knew where his roots were in his family, his wife, and that he was, in a way, most admirable in those circumstances, but he was really not less admirable in his public life. I salute you for your understanding of this man.
You've said it better than I could. Thank you. Yes, sir. Number 15, all right. That's a treasure.
It's a replica jersey which he signed on the back. Thank you. I'm a member of the DC Republican Committee, and you perhaps learned in your research that he, is this on?
Yeah, I guess so. I can hear it anyway.
Okay, that he strongly supported DC voting representation in the House of Representatives. I just wondered what you may have learned about that.
I'm afraid it wouldn't surprise me, but I'm afraid I haven't run into that. I've been doing tax policy and foreign policy. He did. Good. That's the right thing to do. Jimmy Kemp is my authority on all contemporary matters, especially what he thought of this and what he thought of that. We should?
5:15 already.
Okay, good. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.